Hey, it's Luke Frazier, CEO of Stepwise Innovation, and welcome to the Stepwise Innovation interview series, where we speak with innovation leaders and practitioners to hear about their experience in the space and to get some tips and advice on how we can all make more of an impact. To listen to all the interviews and to learn more about Stepwise, head over to stepwiseinnovation.com.
All right, let's get into it. Who's Leanna? What are you up to? Where have you been?
Yes. So I kind of got into innovation very in an unorthodox manner, I guess you could say. I actually started in finance. So I started in investment banking and private equity. I wanted to start my own business. So after I had done, a few years of finance, saved up enough money, decided to go off and enter the wonderful world of entrepreneurship and started something in the event planning space. Eventually, I explored that entire area of small event planning to large event planning, and developed like this MVP concierge, and ultimately decided that investing money in the technology for me, I wasn't passionate enough about it. And I saw that technology was just going to wasn't going to be enough to solve the problems for a customer in that space. And so I decided that I wanted to learn more about how to do this in a repeatable format, to learn really quickly and pivot till you do have a solution that works and gets you to product market fit. And so I had a few friends actually that worked at Bionic, a very small innovation consulting firm, started by a guy named David Kidder and Berkowitz, and started working there. And then eventually, about a year into my working with them, they got acquired by Accenture Song in particular, which is their innovation and marketing arm.
Awesome. So startup to corporate innovation. So what's the purview of your role at Accenture?
Yes. So my role at Accenture, I'm now an entrepreneur in residence, which means I kind of lead client engagements from all the way from ideation through to kind of the build stage, where you're building something out and testing it with customers. And the hope is once we get to product market fit, it gets reabsorbed back into the organization, some department within the larger enterprise. So we're really focused on that 0 to 1 phase and doing it, de-risking along the way in a repeatable and speedy format.
Cool. So how does this experience compare to your startup experience trying to build that?
I would say it's different in that when you're in a startup, you're accountable to yourself and your investors, if you have investors. And so there's a lot more freedom to do what you want to do. But there's also there's less accountability. So you have to really set the pace and set the schedule and set the agenda. It's similar in this, but you're accountable to, people within the organization who it's their job to understand what you're doing, how much progress you're making. There's a lot more, I would say, that's on the line for these co-founders the co-founders within the enterprise that are putting their careers at risk per se, doing something entrepreneurship, which doesn't necessarily have a path to a promotion path. So there's a lot more, I guess, emotional. It's just a different set of like emotional accountability on both ends.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that people who enter into in your structure the co-founder role from the client side standing,
Yeah.
the corporate side, or anyone kind of venturing into an innovation role in a corporation, like the path is less clear.
The path is less clear, and it's similar for a startup. Like I could have stayed in private equity and just risen through the ranks, and who knows where I'd be. I'd probably be an MD right by now. But
don't think about that.
It's really on both ends, you are putting, in some sense, your career on the line to pursue something you're passionate about. And I think that is pretty exciting, because you do meet a lot of people in this field. I mean, occasionally you'll meet the co-founder that just doesn't want to be doing this, or didn't know what to expect when they were getting into it. But there's people who are really passionate about what they do, and super smart people on both ends.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you mentioned that there is still a level of emotional, like, taxing, I guess. Yeah, I found in my work with corporate innovators, like a lot of the role and support, like, yeah, there's frameworks and design and software build and like testing criteria. But a lot of it is like also being someone else with them, like doing something that's hard.
Therapist.
Yeah. Do you find that like in your work too?
Yes, I would say I did a lot of personal development before I entered this phase in my career. And so starting in my early 30s, I just invested in myself, because going through the entrepreneurship process, I realized fear was something that was actually debilitating to me. And I knew that I needed to work on it. And so I have tactics and methods to just get myself out of that headspace. But you realize, for folks, until you're faced with that type of situation, a lot of people don't necessarily recognize that about themselves and haven't done that type of work. And I think it's just you grow a lot, whether you're doing a startup solo or within side a firm. You grow a lot personally and emotionally by doing the work.
Yeah, it's an interesting call out. I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, tried to start a tech company, and was debilitated by fear.
Yeah.
So much so I didn't know what next step to take. I was so afraid of taking the next step. I was afraid to ask for help.
Yeah. It's interesting. And also it's being afraid of succeeding in a way. I found myself even if I was getting traction and hearing good things, I realized that if I did succeed, this would be the next 5 to 10 years of my life. And I was like, am I ready for that? I don't know.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
So for someone starting a business inside a company or outside a company, what's one tip on when that voice comes in and the fear voice comes in, what's one way to combat that?
Yeah, I think so I'll give you an example. A lot of co-founders, when they innovate and they're doing competitor research, and you have a solution you're going after that you have some validation for, and they start doing competitor research, and they see all these other folks in the market, they can get cold feet about doing it. I don't know if it's a tactic I have just to think about, particularly on the enterprise side. You have a whole enterprise backing you, and you have their resources, their expertise, their financial backing. That is super helpful to know, and just reminding them of that. And then I think a lot of times that's why firms, it's really interesting to see large enterprises not innovate because of the competitive dynamic. But honestly, if they could do it as well as startups could do it, they would certainly, crush the competition. It's just having that vision and the people who are passionate enough to pursue it.
Yeah. So you mentioned before your role encompasses like pretty like broad spectrum of things. So 0 to 1, ideation to build. What's kind of like the best part of your job right now? What's your favorite part of it all?
The best part of my job right now, I would say, is seeing something come to life and seeing it actually fulfill the vision we had for it. So like we're working on a solution right now that's supposed to make a super daunting process easier. And we've heard now from customers that, yes, this is actually much easier. It's less overwhelming. That is really, really fulfilling to hear, because a lot of, blood, sweat, and tears goes into just getting an initial MVP to the point where you can release it. It's not buggy. It's not super buggy. The designs, everyone has like hemmed and hawed over the designs, and just, everyone has an opinion. So getting it to the point where you've built something that you feel proud enough to put in front of customers is super fulfilling.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What's the hardest part of it all?
The hardest part is, I would say, probably, especially doing this for enterprises, bringing the stakeholders along on your journey, because they're not there every day seeing the wins you're seeing. And you will hit bumps in the road. And so in some ways, because they're not seeing the wins, the bumps scare them more. And so having someone internally that can convey the message to them, and carry them, bring them, see the vision that the team is seeing, I would say is really difficult, especially because we're not on the client side. So I can't take that role and do that. So there is somebody at the company that actually has to take on that role.
That's interesting. You mentioned that overall, the challenge is bringing internal stakeholders along, that oftentimes they see the bumps, but they don't see the wins. Can you say more about that?
Yes, I'm not going to say they don't see the wins, but I think to do this, there's a certain level of optimism that you have to have as a co-founder and just in innovation. And so you have to take the bumps with a grain of salt. And you have to kind of stick to the vision. I guess it goes back to managing your emotional stability, but you have to persistently pursue the vision that the team sees, and not let those bumps deter you. And not everyone in an organization has that mindset. So it does take a certain person to do that well.
Right. Yeah. And perhaps even some like expectation setting up front, like, hey, we're trying to build something entirely new to the world.
Yeah.
We're going to run into a lot of headaches and bumps. So like when we get them, like we knew they were coming, they're still going to be annoying, but like we're not going to freak out over it.
Yeah. Yeah. No product is ever built on time, on budget. There's never no competitors in your market. If you have that, then maybe you need to rethink what you're building. It's just, there's always headwinds. And so like being able to manage not only your own emotions, but also the people who you report to and the people who are making funding decisions about the project, it's a real skill for, I think that's the biggest skill set like entrepreneurs and co-founders need to have.
And say the skill again.
being able to manage the set expectations and manage the vision and the story of the venture internally.
Yeah. How does someone do that well, I guess?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it takes some experience with, knowing the business, knowing the venture, anticipating road bumps along the way or challenges along the way, but also having an idea of how you can circumvent them or fix it. So
Right.
like you said, setting those expectations so you know what's coming, but also saying, hey, or maybe we didn't see this coming, but we know how we're going to fix it. This is how we're going to tackle it, and we're working on it, or we have already fixed it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that instilled a lot of confidence in leadership.
I worked with a few years ago on an innovation project, and the consultancy that was helping us out, at the beginning of the project, they asked us to assign leadership like a couple of superhero roles.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was Hulk. And you essentially were asking one leader of like, hey, who wasn't your, project lead, like, hey, when we run into something internally that is a big blocker for us, for this venture to be successful, like, we need help knocking that down. And so I just have seen like there is a Hulk inside the org who has enough seniority, and you don't have that many asks, but you might have like 2 to 3 Hulk asks. And they're like, okay, yeah, I can send that email.
Yeah.
And that gets locked down.
That is, so it works differently in every organization. And I think one of our strong suits was actually getting really good at developing that infrastructure for clients, because it's necessary when you're dealing with marketing teams and legal teams and all kind of teams that are so used to large enterprise, doing this from a large enterprise perspective where you're super risk averse and super like have your T's crossed and I's dotted, that you need people on your side who kind of understand the mission and are willing to think creatively about workarounds. And so like we call it a go fast team. But it's people that you train from all of these departments to help you go faster through the organization. And they really kind of understand the purpose of the incubator or the innovation team and are on your side to get things done and move through the organization a little more quickly.
Yeah, that sounds really useful instead of just coming with an ask like day of.
Yeah, I've also seen on the flip side where it was the co-founder's responsibility to do all of that, and it's a tall task. It puts a lot of pressure on them. So like the more you can create the infrastructure where it's already in place, so they kind of don't have to each learn it on their own, it is super helpful. It does save time. It ends up saving time and saving money. So you're not experimenting on the spot, and each co-founder doesn't have to learn that on their own.
Right. Oh, that's neat. Yeah, build the infrastructure once, so that you use multiple times. How much do you think of like the corporate entrepreneur's role is sales?
Sales internally?
Yeah, I guess both.
On the internal side, it's 100% sales. Like it's, talking passionately about what you're building, socializing it internally, and a lot of times you need support from other teams who don't necessarily have to support you. They have the choice to say no. And so the more convincingly you can speak about the value of the venture, and what it could do in the future for the business at large is really important. And I find that's like the one skill set the co-founder needs to have from an internal perspective, or the most important skill set, I would say. Externally, it's probably less important, especially if you're working with consultants. It depends on the client. Some clients have expectations that their co-founders are bringing real expertise in the form of sales or product or business. And I think that gets more important when you reach the later stages of the build. And so you're starting to get into scaling, bringing in customers repeatedly. It becomes really important to have co-founders that could probably lead the business as it reaches, the next phase of its trajectory. But that all depends, because you could just hire to train for that role.
Right.
You could hire external expertise.
You mentioned just now, and then what you mentioned earlier on in the kind of your role description of building businesses that eventually find a home in the company, or a natural landing spot in the company. This comes up a lot, especially with early teams, of like, how early does an organization or a specific venture need to have an answer for that? Like, what's going to happen to this?
I think they should actually ideate with that in mind to some degree. And like, as you get closer to launching the business, you're socializing it amongst the teams that you think it could end up finding a home with. But I do think I wouldn't pursue anything that I don't think would, or I wouldn't advise pursuing anything that I don't think could find a home, because what ends up happening is, eventually the innovation team, usually their budget is limited. And so it needs to transition somewhere. And if there's no place for it to transition, it probably dies at some point.
Yeah. I've seen it happen so many times where the mandate, or the innovation mandate initially is very broad and flexible. It's like, we don't want to put constraints on this. We want it to, blue sky, come back, build something really interesting. And that I've seen lead to a lot of frustration, because no constraints early on. So you build something or design something really far off, and then there's no place of support, because it doesn't actually help any business unit achieve like any strategic objective.
Yeah.
So there's just no one welcomes it back.
Yeah. I've seen the flip side, where some organizations will actually involve the business unit from the beginning in the ideation phase to help and kind of like fund it with them to come up with something. I don't know what's better though, because I think that's also very limiting, in that you can't pursue certain ideas that potentially in the future may find a home if they're successful. But I think the verdict's still out. I would say ideating with the business unit as opposed to the venture dying altogether and the money being wasted is probably better.
Yeah. I hate for the answer to be like portfolio approach.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of, I think it's important to label and name, like, if we're trying to do something way out here, we let it live for much longer outside the business, and we're willing to take the risk that it doesn't. But like, maybe, the closer to home stuff has a shorter timeline. I think the struggle there is making sure that like funding, like if something on an annual budget plan like that's difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Awesome. You mentioned the Go Fast team. How else have you seen, or what other things have you found work to help innovation teams move quickly?
I would say definitely the Go Fast team. I would also say the teams that I feel like have moved the most quickly are the ones that are best at influencing the stakeholders within the organization, like garnering support from not only people within innovation, those direct reports, or people directly within the team who are higher up and making those funding decisions that affect the venture directly, but also people externally. Because if there's external support, so say you do socialize this with the business unit that you think it could eventually land up in, they can also influence those stakeholders within the department. And I find oftentimes like that is hitting it from all angles, internal, external to your department, and also obviously having a good idea that meets the customer, the external customer's needs. That's like the winning combination of things. And then I would also say, like, a lot of these innovation teams are new and they don't necessarily see the challenges that they're gonna face 5 or 10 years down the line very early. So very early, you're right, they're like, blue sky, let's do anything. And later on, they're like, oh, we actually don't have the money to fund a B2B SaaS software solution, because you have to, from an investing standpoint, you're putting more money into those types of solutions upfront, like an enterprise grade solution. It requires more money and the payoff is longer term. So like defining that criteria upfront and early, the earlier you can define it and narrow down what you're willing to invest in and maybe what doesn't fit the sometimes unsaid needs of this clients, is really helpful. Because there are definitely different decisions I would have made had I known some of the challenges we would hit later on.
Yeah, that's a really good call out of like really upfront trying to be explicit and like call out. I've recently just called them like internal acceptance criteria, like for this to be successfully brought back in, what needs to be met. And it's funny you laughed at you were mentioning like, you want to hit it from all angles and really socialize with everyone and make it something the consumer wants. And well, I think a lot of like methodology is really just focused on like customer empathy and customer desirability, which is paramount. But if we're doing that in the corporate environment and not focusing on the corporate environment, then it's never gonna. It's never.
You can have the greatest idea and people are like, we don't care. This doesn't hit any of our objectives as a larger enterprise.
Yeah. I've for sure been pitching that great idea before that didn't get funded. All right, Leanna, last question, and you have already shared a ton of awesome things. Someone is starting a new innovation role on Monday, new innovation team to a company. What advice do you have for them?
Be prepared to step on some toes. I actually think going into this with thick skin is, depending on your role, like you may be the co-founder within or the entrepreneur within a firm, or you may be the person supporting that entrepreneur and helping move things along for them. But regardless, it's unavoidable to step on toes. I think that's probably a big trait for being influential and having thick skin. You have to know you can't like bulldoze everything, but at certain points to get what you want to get done, you do have to kind of push the boundaries a little bit. So it's not for those faint of heart, for sure. It does require a little bit of thick skin. What other advice would I give? Don't get emotionally involved in what you're building. I think that is for, particularly in enterprise, when innovating within an enterprise environment, things can get killed for all kinds of different reasons. And it's not that it's a bad idea or, unvalidated. It's just the nature of the beast. So it's really important to not kind of get too attached.
Yeah. May I call that like you need detached passion?
Yeah.
That's great. Awesome. Leanna, a pleasure to chat. I could ask you questions for the rest of the afternoon, but I won't.
No, this was awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much for chatting.